So it is my pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Samantha Montano. I first learned of Dr. Montano's work after listening to the Disasterology episode of the hit science podcast, Ologies, which I know probably some of you are fans of. She's also the author of a very appropriately named book, Disasterology, Dispatches from the Frontlines of the Climate Crisis. Dr. Montano's research interests cut across areas of emergency management, including nonprofits, volunteerism, and informal efforts in disaster, the intersection of disaster and climate change, gender disparities in disaster, and disaster media coverage.
In addition to being an author, Dr. Samantha Montano is an assistant professor at Massachusetts Maritime Academy, where she teaches courses on issues related to emergency management and disaster policy. Her doctoral degree is in emergency management from North Dakota State University. She's an advocate for emergency management, policy reform, and disaster justice. And so with that, I'd like to bring Samantha up. Thank you.
Perfect, sounds good. Let me take this off so you can hear me better. All right, hi everyone. Thanks for having me tonight. I'm excited to be here with you all and talk about the disaster side of this water conference. So I wanted to get started just by telling you a little bit about how I got started in emergency management, how I got interested in studying disasters. So I grew up in Maine along the coast, and in 2005, Hurricane Katrina and the levee failure happened in New Orleans and along the Gulf Coast. Being in Maine, I was very far removed from the event, and I was in high school at the time, so I kind of only had a vague understanding of how bad things were, specifically in New Orleans. I had the opportunity to go down to the city to volunteer for a week, and when I got there, I was completely blown away by the extent of the damage in the city. Just every single street that you went down for miles and miles, there were just these mountains of debris on either side of the street. Every single house, every single building had been affected in some way. Every single person in the city needed something. And as I looked around at all of the people who were there to help, which, you know, there were New Orleanians there doing the work themselves. There were thousands of volunteers that were like me that had come in from out of state, from countries from around the world to help. It still became very obvious that there were not enough people there for all of the needs that people had throughout the city. And so I decided that I was going to move to New Orleans to help with the recovery in a more long-term and more sustained way. So a year later, I moved down to New Orleans, and I just started to work with a whole bunch of different disaster recovery nonprofits. There were groups that had either existed before and kind of were expanding their work into recovery. There were also all of these new groups that had formed in the aftermath of Katrina that were dealing with literally every single thing that you can imagine related to rebuilding the city. So working with housing nonprofits, environmental nonprofits, working with groups that were focused on specific populations like the elderly or children, helping groups that were there to help people translate insurance documents, to figure out how to fill out FEMA paperwork and navigate the kind of financial side of recovery. So anything and everything that needed to be done in the city, and I kind of just jumped from group to group, helping wherever I could whenever there was a need. And throughout that process, so over the span of 4 or 5 years, I had this front row seat to the largest recovery in US history. And I was not impressed by what I was seeing. So of course, there were people there helping, there were people doing all of this amazing work, but there were perpetually these unmet needs. It was very clear the disparities along the lines of race and class, of which neighborhoods were able to rebuild back more quickly than others, where aid money was flowing throughout the city. And so I started to kind of think about disasters in this new way of thinking specifically about the recovery, this time period that comes after, that lasts for many, many years, and in the case of Katrina, for over a decade, and thinking about what programs, what policies, what resources existed for the people who were going through those disasters to help them or to enable them to recover, and where there were failures in how the recovery in New Orleans was unfolding. So at the time, or when I started this work, I didn't really realize I was interested in disasters generally. I was just very zeroed in and focused on rebuilding New Orleans specifically. But while I was living in New Orleans doing this recovery work, the BP oil disaster happened along the coast of Louisiana. And because I had been working with those environmental groups in the city, when it happened and we began to understand the scope of the impacts that were going to be felt along the coast, we kind of dropped the recovery work we were doing in the city and started going down to the coast to help as we could, kind of as the oil was still spilling, as the response was unfolding, and then into the recovery. So a lot of this work involved just being there in the community, being an extra set of hands for locals that were organizing protests, who were talking with the media, explaining the impacts that they were feeling, beginning to document the damage that was occurring, beginning to document the negative health impacts that folks were feeling. Again, similar to what we were doing in the city, kind of whatever needed to be done, stepping in to try and help and connect resources with the folks that were impacted, and kind of all of these resources that were coming in nationally to what were, really small communities along the coast. And in the process of doing that, I got to witness for the first time really a response unfold. So different than the recovery, the actual response where people are flooding into the area, where it's on CNN 24/7, where the actual life-saving, or in this case, largely environmental saving actions were being taken. And it's a totally different mindset. It's a totally different kind of culture that comes about. And witnessing that response was, again, very frustrating in some similar ways to recovery. There were a lot of inefficiencies in that response. In this response in particular, there was real tension and difficulties managing the interaction between all of the various government agencies from the federal, state, and local levels with the BP primarily, but the corporations that were involved, private industries involvement, and just trying to figure out how to manage all of these different moving parts, the lack of communication, lack of coordination. Again, in the same way that I sensed something wasn't right with how we were approaching recovery, it seemed very clear here, particularly so soon in the wake of Katrina's failed response, that we were seeing that again unfold with BP on the coast. So in the process of commuting back and forth between New Orleans and the Southeast Louisiana coast, I started to drive along this road. It's called Louisiana State Highway 1, and it kind of takes you down from the city area down to these coastal communities and ends in a place called Grand Isle, which was where a lot of the response to BP was centered around. And prior to this, I would have considered myself an environmentalist. I was concerned about climate change, but I hadn't really fully at this point made this connection between climate change and the disasters that I was interested in. In retrospect, there are obvious connections, but at the time, particularly in New Orleans, we were really, really hyper-focused on rebuilding houses, getting people in safe housing, getting kind of just this basic, basic infrastructure fixed, getting roads redone, kind of those most basic things that even when we were talking about the environment, it was in the context of, well, since we're rebuilding someone's house, let's at least put solar panels on. It's good for the environment, but the real reason we were doing it was that it was going to lower their electric bill each month. And so, there was this kind of environmental ethos that was going on, but it wasn't really this explicit connection with climate change. But driving down and starting to spend a lot more time in Grand Isle and on the Louisiana coast, it became extremely apparent immediately that climate change was not this far off issue for the future, which back in 2010, it still sometimes kind of felt like, and was something that was affecting the state of Louisiana right then. And it was even more poignant because, of course, this was happening, or I was having these realizations in the midst of an oil disaster, right, where you very explicitly were seeing the repercussions of the fossil fuel industry. And so here you have, this is what the coast looks like. This is one of the old roads that has gone under. A new highway has been built. But these roads go through the wetlands, which are disappearing in this area. There's constant erosion, subsidence. Roads are flooding at high tide in certain places. Where they are building new infrastructure, new roads, it's for the purpose of the oil companies that have their refineries down here to be bringing, transporting their goods inland. And then you have houses along the sides that are up on stilts. You have people who are still trying to live in these communities. And you can stand here and you can look out at the oil rigs out in the distance. You can look at the refineries that are in the background, and you can see these causes of what's happening, and you can see the consequences. You can see the loss of land. You can see the people beginning to move away from these areas, the constant disasters, constant hurricanes that are now being made more severe by climate change, all happening in this one kind of relatively small area along the Louisiana coast. So this photo over on the right is a picture of me with some of my students, some of my emergency management students in 2019. We're standing along one of these roads. We just pulled over so I could kind of point out some different things as I was explaining this to them. And this point where we're standing, Port Fourchon, is right before you go into Grand Isle. This is where the eye of Hurricane Ida hit a couple of weeks ago and devastated Grand Isle and all of the homes that are located along these roads. It kind of, for a while, followed the path of Highway 1. So again, unfortunately, another example of how the climate crisis is incredibly present on the Louisiana coast specifically. So as I was in Louisiana dealing with all of these different disasters, trying to kind of piece together all of these different moving parts of these events, I also went with a group of volunteers to Joplin, Missouri after their tornado around that time, just to help with some of the basic recovery work, and I went to Tuscaloosa, Alabama after their tornado, and started to kind of go from disaster to disaster around the country and see that the way we were approaching these disasters wasn't working for anybody. So for some people, it was working much less than others, but it really wasn't working for anyone. And so started to think more about how we can prevent disasters before they actually happen. When we can't prevent them completely, how can we make them less bad when they happen? How can we help people recover more quickly, more justly? And so in trying to sort out how to go about and do all of this, I fortunately found my way into research and started to think about how research specifically could help change the way we think about disasters. At this point in doing this work, I was primarily working in the nonprofit sector, doing like community organizing, activism type work. And so I was pretty ignorant of kind of the more formal and kind of government-led emergency management. To the extent that I knew anything about it, it was that FEMA was a bad word in New Orleans after Katrina, and it wasn't an agency that you necessarily wanted to be associated with. And so luckily, though, I found my way into a graduate program in emergency management specifically. And I was pretty skeptical about this at first for the aforementioned reasons. But in the process of having this be kind of my opportunity to dig into the disaster research, to better understand and learn what we know about disasters already and how that could be used in the work that we were doing in the field, I started to understand that emergency management is much more than FEMA, and that it is this more comprehensive system that we have and have been developing over the course of 70 or 80 years. And so I wanted to kind of break this down for you. I find that a lot of people were like me and don't really have a sense of how this emergency management system is set up, particularly now given our context of the climate crisis and the urgency with which communities need help before, during, and after disasters, given this context of increasing risk across the country. Having this kind of broader, more holistic understanding of what emergency management is really, really important. So emergency management as a profession is kind of who you think about as working with FEMA, working with emergency management agencies. These are the people who are day-to-day doing emergency management work in communities, federal, state, local levels, internationally. And they are working on all kinds of different tasks that are related to reducing vulnerability in communities, working with communities that are trying to cope with disaster. So we use what we call the disaster life cycle in emergency management. We go through 4 different phases. So usually when folks think of emergency management, like I did when I first started this work, we usually think of response, which are those measures taken to save lives, property, and the environment, kind of what I was seeing for the first time with the BP disaster. And that is obviously a really important part of what we do in emergency management, but it is only one small part, and actually time-wise, it's the thing we spend the least amount of time doing. We're also overseeing and working on the recovery. So everything that I was doing in New Orleans related to Katrina, that work that lasts for years, if not decades, the actual rebuilding of a community. And then ahead of time, we're also supposed to be working on preparedness, so doing things to ready ourselves, ready our communities to go through that response and recovery, to try and make that response and recovery more effective, more efficient. And then probably most interesting to folks in the climate fields, we also do what we call mitigation. For many of you, this is probably what you would call adaptation. But these are sustained actions that we're doing to prevent or reduce the impacts of a hazard. So everything from lifting homes up to building levees to wetland restoration, sand replenishment, any of those kinds of tasks that we do. Again, many of those are kind of being talked about more frequently or kind of repurposed within a climate context. Those are things that we've been doing in emergency management for many, many decades. So as you can see, emergency management is covering this full life cycle of disasters. It's when you are doing it well and doing it right, it is this incredibly comprehensive profession where you have emergency managers that specialize in these different areas. You have emergency managers that are working on these tasks every single day in their community. In addition to covering this full spectrum, we're also covering a full spectrum of hazards. So for the purposes here, obviously we're talking more about these more climate-driven, climate-related hazards under this natural hazards category, but we're also having emergency managers expand their roles into these other areas as well: chemical hazards, nuclear hazards, computer failures. Cybersecurity is becoming a huge deal. Mass violence and terrorism as well in the post 9/11 era has driven a lot of the work that's done in emergency management. So when we kind of think again about this full spectrum of tasks that emergency managers are involved in, the way we're thinking about risk in our communities, we're trying not to really silo off these different hazards from one another. There are some obvious differences between them, but for the sake of the kind of overall resiliency of our communities, we need to be thinking about all of these, right? These all can affect one another, and the expertise that is needed to deal with them can differ, and it again involves a lot of coordination and the involvement of a lot of different stakeholder groups. So again, when I started my emergency management doctoral program, I was coming out of the nonprofit sector, and I was aware that kind of government was involved in emergency management, but I didn't really think that much about the private sector's involvement. Was kind of just beginning to understand how important the media is in all phases of emergency management, how that is influencing everything that we're doing in emergency management, for better or for worse. And that when we talk about emergency management, it's not only about these other groups that are coming in to help when something happens, but also about the people who live in those communities, the survivors themselves, and how they are active participants in all phases of disaster, and how they need to be integrated into our overall system here. So again, when we're thinking about emergency management, we're talking about this really, really broad profession that is going across this full life cycle, is covering every hazard you can imagine under the sun, and is having to address the needs and coordinate with all of the different groups that operate within these different stakeholder categories. When we're talking about doing mitigation or doing preparedness or response or recovery, we're talking about the involvement of hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of different groups that are falling into these stakeholder categories that need to be involved in these various ways. And it becomes this really complex job that has to be done, which is why we have developed over many decades a system to try and help us coordinate all of this work that has to happen in emergency management. So as I learned about the profession, I was working within the discipline of emergency management, which is the scientific study of how we interact and cope with vulnerabilities and hazard events when they happen. So you heard at the beginning, my intro, we talked about the word disasterology here. It's the name of my book. Disasterology is the term that I use to describe disaster research as a whole. There are people in every single discipline that are studying disasters: historians, economists, psychologists, sociologists, engineers. Everybody is interested in disasters in some way, and kind of increasingly so, again, given our climate risk. And that's great. We need a lot of different disciplines. We need every discipline to be involved in studying disasters, because disasters impact all parts of life. Every theoretical orientation, every theoretical perspective provides insights into disasters and potentially into how we manage them at some point in this disaster life cycle. So that is really, really great to see that many disciplines involved. At the same time, this does propose a bit of a logistical challenge here. If you are an emergency manager who, works in the basement of your town hall, and you have a huge flood risk in your community, and you want to use empirical evidence to drive the decisions that you're making, this kind of really, really broad, all discipline involved approach to studying disasters isn't going to be super effective for you because you're not going to know where to find that research. Everybody who's doing that research is using different terminology, coming from a different place, building off of different research. And so what we found is that although we had been studying, or people had been studying disasters for over a century, dating back to in the social sciences, dating back to the Halifax explosion in the early 1900s in Canada, that research was not really making its way into practice, and it was not influencing policy. It wasn't really changing how we were going about managing these disasters really at any point of this life cycle, to the extent that researchers were able to get their work out there. It was on this really kind of one-to-one basis, and it wasn't having this kind of overall effect that we would hope to see in terms of kind of communicating that work, communicating that science with the agencies and groups and the public generally. And so around the kind of early 2000s, kind of right around post 9/11 era, we start to see the emergence of the discipline of emergency management, which one of the major things that we have done and kind of the start of this discipline is a synthesis of the existing research on disasters across all of these disciplines that are doing this work to try to reconcile all of those findings, to try and connect those findings to policy, to practice, and again, move this research out as we're kind of building our own theory within our discipline. So that was the work that I started doing in grad school and the research that I continue now. And as I mentioned, we kind of the major elephant in the room here for emergency management has been this realization that we are a frontline system for climate change for kind of a long time, longer than it should have been in emergency management, particularly within the profession. We have been very focused on kind of what is the next event, again, post 9/11, a real shift in focus of attention and resources to Homeland Security, this focus and emphasis on terrorism, pulling us away from these more natural hazards, dealing with climate change specifically. Certainly more recently, political sway over pushing climate change to the back burner, not moving forward as quickly as we need to within the profession to address this increasing risk across the country. And unfortunately, we have no shortage of examples of communities across the country that are bearing the brunt of these climate impacts. We're seeing the kind of repercussion of not only climate change, but of decades of policy decisions that have created risk in communities, the lack of infrastructure maintenance, development decisions about how and where we're building. All of these different factors that create risk are coming together, colliding with one another to create this kind of perfect storm in emergency management of this rippling risk across the country. So everything from the persistent wildfires out west to hurricane after hurricane along the Gulf Coast, the East Coast, flooding in the Midwest, all of the storms we have, right? All of these are the heat waves in the Pacific Northwest. We're starting to much more clearly see these connections to climate change. We're starting to really see these manifest in our communities in the US and of course around the world. And as a repercussion of that, emergency managers are really beginning to, again, should have happened sooner, but really beginning to have this wake-up call about what that means for the profession of emergency management. What does it mean to be a frontline system or the frontline system in these communities that is supposed to be addressing this risk, trying to prevent these disasters from happening? How do you prepare your communities for this range of scenarios that we can game out depending on the extent to which we address climate change itself? And what do you do when you are responding repeatedly and more quickly to disaster and disaster across the country. And what do you do when you start seeing that some communities are getting stuck in this cycle of recovery? So for us in emergency management, as we're thinking about climate change, there's kind of, from my perspective, three major challenges that we have here. So the first major takeaway in terms of the climate crisis is that we have this increased urgency for hazard mitigation. So doing mitigation in our communities has always been important. It's always been something that falls within the purview of emergency management. It's not something that has gotten a lot of attention, not something that has gotten a lot of money put towards it in Congress to this point. And as we move forward, again, this is going to affect the extent to which we experience these disasters in our community, how bad they are. So in emergency management, we're having to do everything from completely redoing all of our risk assessments for our communities. Our risk is dramatically changing from place to place. You have places like New York City where in the wake of Ida, you see historic rainfalls, you see flooding in a way that you've never seen before from a rainfall event in New York City. You have, all of these unprecedented disasters, as the media calls them, across the country, and part of the decision-making that has to come in emergency management about where we use our resources should be rooted in these risk assessments that we're doing in our communities. And again, this is difficult to do. Traditionally, we have really relied on the historical data in emergency management to kind of assume what our future risk will be. And we can't do that anymore. We have to incorporate future projections from climate change into those risk assessments, which is a difficult thing to do. It's particularly difficult at the local level where you don't have the expertise, you don't have the resources to do that. We also are starting to see the Biden administration has put more money towards hazard mitigation, which is great. But we also have this issue of how to efficiently and equitably use that money. How do we make decisions about which communities receive that money and which communities receive it first? How are we going to prioritize when you have every community in the world, or every community in the country, every city in the country that has mitigation needs? How are you going to start figuring out how to do that ethically? What do the cost-benefit analyses look like? And how are we factoring questions of factoring in equitable use of those funds into those cost-benefit analysis? And how do we know how can these local communities, again, that very often have a lack of resources, how are they going to be able to actually access those federal grants? So this kind of brings us to this second overarching issue that we have. Across the country, we see totally different versions of emergency management agencies. You have New York City on one end of the spectrum that has hundreds of employees, that has millions of dollars in their budget, that is, one of the most experienced, if not the most experienced emergency management agency in the world. And then you have on the other end of the spectrum, communities across the country that have a part-time emergency manager, somebody who is also the fire chief and is expected to write grants to get their community mitigation, millions of dollars in mitigation dollars from FEMA to build a levee in their community, something that they know nothing about. So we have this really wide spectrum in these agencies, and that is contributing to this inequality we see in how these grants are, how these federal dollars especially are being distributed across the country. So one of the most important things that we need to do as we think about trying to adapt to climate change, think about addressing this climate risk in our communities, is growing the capacity of these emergency management agencies. How can we make sure that they have funding to fully staff their agencies, to hire the right people, the best people, to work on these grants, to create these plans for their communities? How do we make sure that they have the resources that they need so that we are doing everything we can to mitigate and prepare ahead of time? And then, as I mentioned, we have more and more communities that are forced into this recovery process, which we, again, have this long history of experience and a long list of research that has looked at the problems with our approach to recovery, has looked at the inefficiencies, the lack of equitable spending in recovery. And how do we address that? How do we figure out how to create a just recovery for communities? How do we do this when we have places in Southwest Louisiana, Southeast Texas, the Carolinas, California, that are experiencing disasters so quickly that they are not getting through one recovery before the next disaster happens, and they get thrown into recovery again? We have parts of the country that have been through 3, 4, 5 disasters in the span of just 3 years. They are completely trapped in this cycle of recovery. We are not moving fast enough to be able to get them out of that cycle, and we are not even really having the conversations nationally in terms of changes to national policy for how we are going to do that moving forward. And again, climate change makes all of this worse, right? It makes all of this more urgent. It makes this happen all at a much, much larger scale. So when we think about climate change more broadly, I like to kind of summarize this as there's 2 kind of categories of problems here. There's mitigating climate change itself, which is what the vast majority of our conversations are about. And then we have problem number 2, which is managing the consequences of climate change, or largely what would fall under the heading of adaptation. And when we think about these 2 problems, the extent to which we address climate change, the extent to which the world rallies and kind of changes course here, is going to have a huge effect on problem number 2. It's going to have a huge effect on us in emergency management. Are we planning for worst case scenarios, 7-foot sea level rise on the coast? Are we planning for 2 feet, 3 feet of sea level rise, kind of mid-range scenarios? We don't know that yet, right? I'm sure we all have guesses of where we're headed, but we don't know for sure yet. And that creates this real range of scenarios for us in emergency management as we're trying to think about how we do damage control here. It also is important to point out here that, as I said, we spend the majority of our time talking about problem number 1, and that is extremely important, right? That is affecting number 2, and so that matters. However, at the same time, we have to be doing more with problem number 2. We have to be doing more in terms of adaptation, and specifically within emergency management, because we already have communities across the country that are living through this right now. And they're gonna need more help in the future, but they need help right now. And the system that we have to help them is not functioning to the extent that we need it to. It's not adequate enough to meet all of these needs. And so because of that, I would advocate for significant changes to emergency management policy, specifically comprehensive emergency management reform at the national level, with matches at the state and local level as well. Again, in thinking about how we're not only going to address the problems that are existing and manifesting within this system today, but also how we start to build the capacity of this system to enable us to address the needs of 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, if we dare to think that far ahead. And so I'll kind of end on this note here, which is that emergency management, again, it kind of feels like a bit of a niche area. Again, not a system that a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about, but it's one that's operating around us all the time. It's one that affects every single one of us. It is the system that we rely on to try and protect us from these disasters. It's a system we rely on to save us when a disaster happens, and it's a system we use to recover after disaster. And we have to, especially in the kind of broader climate conversation here, need to give more space to emergency management, give more space to disaster survivors, the survivors particularly of these climate-related disasters who are experiencing this firsthand, and make sure that their experiences, their perspective, again, the century of research that we have on disasters is what is driving our conversations about the repercussions of climate change, and all are, of course, driving our practice and driving our policies. So I threw a lot at you. If you want to learn more, you can follow me online, and I also wrote a whole book about it that you can go and read. I talk in the book about New Orleans and BP, living in North Dakota during Standing Rock, all different kinds of disasters across the country that have kind of shaped how our emergency management system operates currently, and how that needs to be kind of rethought in the context of climate change, and talks through some of the kind of changes that we need to this system. So I will stop there if you have questions.
So for those of you who've been with us for most of the day, raise your hand if you have a question and we'll come to you. If not, we're going to get started with some from our webcast. Are there any questions from the live audience? Okay, coming up.
Hi, I'm very excited to read your book.
Thank you.
And I'm wondering how you see the private sector playing more of a role. I was in New York at 9/11 and was totally bewildered that there was not an emergency response communication system at the time. And so a friend of mine were just talking about, like, why isn't there one? And it didn't occur to us in the moment to say, oh, why doesn't the government do it? So we did. And so we created Somewhere Now, which is one of the world's largest communication systems. We had other uses for it. Besides just emergency response, such as alerting, commodity traders, of a certain price point. But that allowed us to keep the company growing between emergencies, right? And keep it vital and vibrant. A friend of mine created Living Homes, which is Planet Prefab. So, starting to even do 3D housings. Some of them were in the New Orleans area. So do you see the private sector playing much more of a role, and or the startup ecosystem here at MIT is amazing, informing them of what's necessary? Are there any other holes that could be patched with commercial enterprises?
Yeah, it's a good question. So part of this is kind of rooted in the history of how we've approached disasters. So we've been really reactive to disasters. So, kind of our mindset in terms of preparing for disasters has been very focused on having people stockpile supplies and having government agencies go to trainings and write these plans that go and sit on a shelf somewhere. And those aren't bad things to do, but to your point, right, there's a million other things that we could be doing to prepare here. And yeah, a lot of that innovation is logically going to come from the private sector. There definitely is a much broader role that could be played by the private sector. But a lot of this has to do with this kind of lack of knowledge. Trying to figure out how to fit into this system is really complicated. A lot of this system is kind of shrouded in mystery. You've really got to just kind of happen to find the people who are already doing it and get advice from them and kind of network your way into into it. So there are a lot of kind of accessibility issues in terms of being able to correctly identify where those gaps exist, correctly identify what those needs are, find the funding and support to be able to create something new to fill those gaps. And then there's this also kind of perpetual issue of being able to sustain that for the long term. So we see a lot of times kind of in the wake of disasters, we see new startups or we see these innovative projects or ideas, whether it's a nonprofit or a business that starts operating in the disaster space, and they have a really great idea and they really have correctly identified a need, but they aren't able to sustain it in the long run. They aren't able to sustain that funding. There is a lot of money that comes flying at a community when a disaster happens, or when one of these large disasters or a catastrophe happens. But that money goes really, really quick. And even though it's billions and billions of dollars that are coming in, it's not really enough to address all those needs, and it's not being spent efficiently. And so it's tough for especially these smaller startups to gain that funding and to be able to sustain that from one disaster to another. So yeah, I mean, if you have like a specific idea or something, I'm happy to talk with anybody about kind of how that fits in or where there's a need. But certainly overall, there is room for greater presence of the private sector.
Now for our next question.
Hi, Dr. Montano. Thinking about the role of information, I was in 2017 Mexico earthquake, and in that moment, one of the biggest assets to evaluate the damages and all the consequences of the earthquake was social media, which helped in giving live information, but also had the potential risk of fake posts. So how do you see the role of social media in live information when reacting to a disaster? And are there established criteria right now on how to use this information, this live information?
Yeah, so again, yeah, social media is huge here. I kind of incorporate it under the media heading in that stakeholder group list that we had, but certainly you're right. So when a disaster happens, you have that response, you have the formal response that happens from government agencies, from the Red Cross or nonprofits or whoever, but you also have this entire informal system that activates, and much of that is spontaneous. It's the survivors themselves who are the true first responders. People are not waiting for official search and rescue teams before they start digging through rubble to find people. They're posting information as it happens. Emergency management agencies get a lot of their information from what people are posting on social media. That is that kind of first round of damage assessments in most cases is coming in from those unofficial sources, those platforms. And so it's hugely important. It is at times driving the entire response. Sometimes we only know a disaster has happened because we see it on social media first. That's where news of it breaks. Social media is driving everything, not only from people learning that a disaster has happened, but where to get help, where they can go if they have help to give. And as you said, there's also obviously misinformation that can come about. There are some efforts, kind of depending on the platform, to try and kind of formalize that platform's role during disasters. So an obvious example here is the Facebook, the safety check that comes up when a disaster happens. Really cool idea of checking in on there. Some logistical challenges with how that actually functions. A lot of delays in people being able to post, kind of delays within Facebook's system of actually activating it, et cetera. So kind of similar issues with Twitter and some of the approaches that they've taken. So this is one of those areas where there could be a lot of room for innovation here, and if those platforms put more resources towards it and more attention towards it, there could be a lot of really amazing things that we could do kind of formally within those platforms, kind of Informally, of course, Facebook groups are one of the driving places that people are getting recovery information years in, right? You have a neighborhood Facebook group where people are posting that information. So informally, people are using social media to expand their social networks, which we know is one of the most important factors in how people are able to respond and recover from disasters. So it is completely at the center of what we're doing. That said, also from a formal perspective, emergency managers are very hesitant on social media. When something happens, the first place we usually go to see what has happened is on Twitter, and usually the official sources are kind of the last to post on there. So that information that you're getting, the timing of it isn't aligning well to help with to help stem that misinformation. So yeah, kind of a wide range of issues.
I have a question from the webcast. So you mentioned earlier that some of the communities, outside of New York City, very experienced, some of these other communities kind of just don't have the resources and experience. So maybe it might be related. So how does the racialization of marginalized communities affect their ability to access disaster relief recovery services?
Yeah, so to put this most bluntly, the U.S. emergency management system was created for middle-class white people in the 1950s, and it has not changed that much since then in terms of policy. And so when you understand that the most severe impacts, the most frequent impacts from disasters are affecting marginalized communities, communities of color, poor communities across the country, there's a complete mismatch between the policies and programs that exist, particularly within FEMA, and the communities that actually need access to that aid. So a really common example that we use is post-Katrina in the lower 9th Ward, a predominantly Black community or Black neighborhood in New Orleans. We saw that they had some of the worst impacts from Katrina in the aftermath and recovery. They've been the last to rebuild. You see a huge population decline in that neighborhood. A large part of that is that the recovery policies were not created to address the particular needs of that neighborhood. One tangible example here is that many people in the lower 9th Ward actually owned their homes, but they had been passed down generationally, and so they didn't have the appropriate kind of official paperwork that was needed to apply for insurance and apply for federal aid in the aftermath. And so there was these extra legal hurdles that homeowners were having to go through to try and access those recovery funding. It was not addressed post-Katrina, and then the same thing happened in Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria. FEMA actually just allegedly fixed this, so hopefully that plays out in the next disaster where we see this issue. But again, that's where you see this kind of cultural difference not having been accounted for in a specific program that is being used to dictate where those recovery dollars are going.
Are there any other questions from the audience?
I can take another one from the webcast. We have a few here. What specific concrete changes would you want to see in emergency management at the national level?
Sure, so it's a very long list. I'll give you my number one thing. So I don't know how many people know this, but prior to 9/11, FEMA was an independent cabinet level agency. And that was really important. It meant that the head of FEMA had a direct line to the White House, to the president when a disaster happens, which is incredibly important because it is the president and the president alone that can sign a presidential disaster declaration and open up federal resources and send FEMA into the affected community. And so during the Clinton administration, the head of FEMA, James Lee Witt, and Bill Clinton had a longstanding relationship. They knew each other well. They worked well together. FEMA had, during the Clinton administration, what is referred to lovingly in emergency management as the golden years of FEMA. There was much more of an emphasis on mitigation, being more proactive in how we approach emergency management. And then in the wake of 9/11, Congress created the Department of Homeland Security and subsumed FEMA within DHS. And as a result, there's this added layer of bureaucracy. And this is something that we still feel the repercussions of today. It's part of the reason the federal response to Katrina failed as spectacularly as it did. And so taking FEMA out of DHS, putting it back as an independent cabinet level agency could have a huge overarching effect on the entirety of the emergency management system. Past that, massive, like much more than we're talking about, increase in funding to the mitigation programs and building out grant programs to help fund those local emergency management agencies to build that capacity at the local level.
Great answer. One more question? All right. We got a lot of good ones. This is tricky. Okay, here's maybe this little existential. So one of the panelists from last year's summit said that there is no such thing as a natural disaster. So what are your thoughts on what is the meaning of disaster and how that is related to what humans do and don't do to prepare?
Yeah, so that person is right. I don't know who that was, but yeah. So yeah, we say in emergency management, there's no such thing as a natural disaster. You'll notice I didn't use that term. I said natural hazard. That's reflective of this issue that disasters are created, our risk is created based on these human decisions, right? An earthquake may be a natural occurrence, but that earthquake taking down buildings, people being trapped, those are because of how we have built, a lack of building codes, not using the correct materials. If people aren't being rescued quick enough, it's because we haven't prepared well enough, right? All of these other human decisions are going to influence that hazard, that earthquake, actually becoming a disaster. And so the problem with using this term natural disaster is that you are obscuring human responsibility to prevent that disaster from happening. You're putting that blame on nature. Similar issue here with like the term act of God, right? You're putting that responsibility on something supernatural rather than on that human responsibility. So if our goal is to actually prevent disasters from happening, which hopefully is our goal, then you need to acknowledge that human responsibility, that this risk is created, that policy is driving how these events manifest, and that includes kind of removing that natural component and focusing on human action. This has become even more important as we factor in climate change, of course, even makes some of those hurricanes or heat waves even further removed from the natural world.
Thank you so much, everyone. A round of applause. Okay, so what an amazing presentation from our keynote speaker to close the first day of the MIT Water Summit. So thank you again to Dr. Samantha Montano for joining us this evening. And maybe we could have another big round of applause for the rest of the speakers we've heard from today. The presentations and panels, I think, have all done a great job identifying some of the challenges associated with understanding and studying resilience in coastal communities. And we, with the MIT Water Summit team, hope you've all enjoyed today's programming, learned something new, and are excited to get involved in future conversations relating to our coastal cities and ecosystems.
Tomorrow, our panels will be focused on topics such as porous cities, blue carbon, coastal conflict and governance, and Indigenous peoples' relationship with water. Please join us via the Zoom webinar. You can find the Zoom link by clicking on the Click Here for Event Details button on our website or checking your Eventbrite registration email. Before we all depart, many thanks are in order. Again, a big thank you to our speakers. This event wouldn't have been what it is without them. A thank you to our summit team for their time and dedication since June. It has been a pleasure to work with you all over these past months and see what we created together. Thank you to all of our sponsors for their support. Thank you to the MIT AV and MIT Video Productions for their help with bringing our conference to life both in person and virtually. And finally, thank you to our audience for coming today and learning about coastal cities and ecosystems. Have a great rest of your evening.